The Enchanted Bluff by Willa Cather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. We had our swim before sundown, and while we were cooking our supper, the oblique rays of light made a dazzling glare on the white sand about us. The translucent red ball itself sank behind the brown stretches of cornfield as we sat down to eat, and the warm layer of air that had rested over the water and our clean sandbar grew fresher and smelled of the rank ironweed and sunflowers growing on the flatter shore. The river was brown and sluggish like any other of the half-dozen streams that water the Nebraska corn lands. On one shore was an irregular line of bald clay bluffs where a few scrub oaks with thick trunks and flat twisted tops threw light shadows on the long grass. The western shore was low and level, with cornfields that stretched to the skyline, and all along the water's edge were little sandy coves and beaches where slim cottonwoods and willow saplings flickered. The turbulence of the river in springtime discouraged milling, and beyond keeping the old red bridge in repair, the busy farmers did not concern themselves with the stream, so the Sandtown boys were left in undisputed possession. In the autumn we hunted quail through the miles of stubble and fodderland along the flat shore, and after the winter skating season was over and the ice had gone out, the spring freshets and flooded bottoms gave us our great excitement of the year. The channel was never the same for 2 successive seasons. Every spring the swollen stream undermined a bluff to the east or bit out a few acres of cornfield to the west and whirled the soil away to deposit it in spumy mud banks somewhere else. When the water fell low in midsummer, new sandbars were thus exposed to dry and whiten in the August sun. Sometimes these were banked so firmly that the fury of the next freshet failed to unseat them. The little willow seedlings emerged triumphantly from the yellow froth, broke into spring leaf, shot up into summer growth, and with their mesh of roots bound together the moist sand beneath them against the batterings of another April. Here and there a cottonwood soon glittered among them, quivering in the low current of air that even on the breathless days when the dust hung like smoke above the wagon road trembled along the face of the water. It was on such an island, and the third summer of its yellow-green, that we built our watchfire. Not in the thicket of dancing willow wands, but on the level terrace of fine sand which had been added that spring, a little new bit of world beautifully ridged with ripple marks and strewn with the tiny skeletons of turtles and fish, all as white and dry as if they had been expertly cured. We had been careful not to mar the freshness of the place, although we often swam out to it on summer evenings and lay on the sand to rest. This was our last watchfire of the year, and there were reasons why I should remember it better than any of the others. Next week the other boys were to file back to their old places in Sandtown High School, but I was to go up to the Divide to teach my first county school in the Norwegian district. I was already homesick at the thought of quitting the boys with whom I had always played, of leaving the river, and going up to a windy plain that was all windmills and cornfields and big pastures, where there was nothing willful or unmanageable in the landscape, no new islands, and no chance of unfamiliar birds, such as often follow the watercourses. Other boys came and went and used the river for fishing or skating, but we 6 were sworn to the spirit of the stream, and we were friends mainly because of the river. There were the 2 Hostler boys, Fritz and Otto, sons of the little German tailor. They were the youngest of us, ragged boys of 10 and 12, with sunburned hair, weather-stained faces, and pale blue eyes. Otto, the elder, was the best mathematician in school and clever at his books, but he always dropped out in the spring term as if the river could not get on without him. He and Fritz caught the fat, horned catfish and sold them about the town, and they lived so much in the water that they were as brown and sandy as the river itself. There was Percy Pound, a fat, freckled boy with chubby cheeks, who took 6 boys' story papers and was always being kept in for reading detective stories behind his desk. There was Tip Smith, destined by his freckles and red hair to be the buffoon of all our games, though he walked like a timid little old man and had a funny, cracked laugh. Tip worked hard in his father's grocery store every afternoon and swept it out before school in the morning. Even his recreations were laborious. He collected cigarette cards and tin tobacco tags indefatigably, and would sit for hours humped up over a snarling little scroll saw which he kept in his attic. His dearest possessions were some little pill bottles that purported to contain grains of wheat from the Holy Land, water from the Jordan and the Dead Sea, and earth from the Mount of Olives. His father had bought these dull things from a Baptist missionary who peddled them, and Tip seemed to derive great satisfaction from their remote origin. The tall boy was Arthur Adams. He had fine hazel eyes that were almost too reflective and sympathetic for a boy, and such a pleasant voice that we all loved to hear him read aloud. Even when he had to read poetry aloud at school, no one ever thought of laughing. To be sure, he was not at school very much of the time. He was 17 and should have finished the high school the year before, but he was always off somewhere with his gun. Arthur's mother was dead, and his father, who was feverishly absorbed in promoting schemes, wanted to send the boy away to school and get him off his hands, but Arthur always begged off for another year and promised to study. I remember him as a tall, brown boy with an intelligent face, always lounging among a lot of us little fellows, laughing at us oftener than with us, but with such a soft, satisfied laugh that we felt rather flattered when we provoked it. In after years, people said that Arthur had become given to evil ways even as a lad, and it is true that we often saw him with the gamblers' sons and with old Spanish Fanny's boy, but if he learned anything ugly in their company, he never betrayed it to us. We would have followed Arthur anywhere, and I am bound to say that he led us into no worse places than the cattail marshes and the stubble fields. These, then, were the boys who camped with me that summer night upon the sandbar. After we finished our supper, we beat the willow thicket for driftwood. By the time we'd collected enough, night had fallen, and the pungent, weedy smell from the shore increased with the coolness. We threw ourselves down about the fire and made another futile effort to show Percy Pound the Little Dipper. We had tried it often before, but he never could get past the big one. "You see those 3 big stars just below the handle, with the bright one in the middle?" said Otto Hostler. "That's Orion'S Belt, and the bright one is the clasp." I crawled behind Otto's shoulder and sighted up his arm to the star that seemed perched upon the tip of his steady forefinger. The Hostler boys did sign fishing at night, and they knew a good many stars. Percy gave up the Little Dipper and lay back on the sand, his hands clasped under his head. "I can see the North Star," he announced contentedly, pointing toward it with his big toe. "Anyone might get lost and need to know that." We all looked up at it. "How do you suppose Columbus felt when his compass didn't point north any more?" Tip asked. Otto shook his head. "My father says that there was another North Star once, and that maybe this one won't last for always. I wonder what would happen to us down here if anything went wrong with it." Arthur chuckled. "I wouldn't worry, Ott. Nothing's apt to happen to it in your time. Look at the Milky Way. There must be lots of good dead Indians." We lay back and looked, meditating, at the dark cover of the world. The gurgle of the water had become heavier. We had often noticed a mutinous, complaining note in it at night, quite different from its cheerful daytime chuckle, and seeming like the voice of a much deeper and more powerful stream. Our water had always been these 2 moods, the one of sunny complacence, the other of inconsolable, passionate regret. "Queer how the stars are all in sort of diagrams," remarked Otto. "You could do most any proposition in geometry with them. They always look as if they meant something. Some folks say everybody's fortune is all written out in the stars, don't they?" "They believe so in the old country," Fritz affirmed, but Arthur only laughed at him. "You're thinking of Napoleon, Fritzy. He had a star that went out when he began to lose battles. I guess the stars don't keep any close tally on Sandtown folks." We were speculating on how many times we could count 100 before the evening star went down behind the cornfields, when someone cried, "There comes the moon, and it's as big as a cartwheel." We all jumped up to greet it as it swam over the bluffs behind us. It came up like a galleon in full sail, an enormous, barbaric thing, red as an angry heathen god. When the moon came up red like that, the Aztecs used to sacrifice their prisoners on the temple top, Percy announced. Go on, Perce. You got that out of golden days. Do you believe that, Arthur? I appealed. Arthur answered quite seriously. Like as not. The moon was one of their gods. When my father was in Mexico City, he saw the stone where they used to sacrifice their prisoners. As we dropped down by the fire again, someone asked whether the mound builders were older than the Aztecs. When we once got upon the mound builders, we never willingly got away from them, and we were still conjecturing when we heard a loud splash in the water. Must have been a big cat jumping, said Fritz. They do sometimes. They must see bugs in the dark. Look what a track the moon makes. There was a long, silvery streak on the water, and where the current fretted up over a big log, it boiled up like gold pieces. Suppose there ever was any gold hid away in this old river? Fritz asked. He lay like a little brown Indian close to the fire, his chin on his hand and his bare feet in the air. His brother laughed at him, but Arthur took the suggestion seriously. Some of the Spaniards thought there was gold up here somewhere. 7 cities chock full of gold, they had it. And Coronado and his men came up to hunt it. The Spaniards were all over this country once. Percy looked interested. Was that before the Mormons went through? We all laughed at this. Long enough before the Pilgrim Fathers, Pierce. Maybe they came along this very river. They always followed the water courses. I wonder where this river really does begin, Tip mused. That was an old and favorite mystery which the map did not clearly explain. On the map, the little black line stopped somewhere in western Kansas. But since rivers generally rose in mountains, it was only reasonable to suppose that ours came from the Rockies. Its destination, we knew, was the Missouri, and the Hostler boys always maintained that we could embark at Sandtown in flood time, follow our noses, and eventually arrive at New Orleans. Now they took up their old argument. If us boys had grit enough to try it, it wouldn't take no time to get to Kansas City and St. Joe. We began to talk about the places we wanted to go to. The Hostler boys wanted to see the stockyards in Kansas City, and Percy wanted to see a big store in Chicago. Arthur was interlocutor and did not betray himself. Now it's your turn, Tip. Tip rolled over on his elbow and poked the fire, and his eyes looked shyly out of his queer, tight little face. My place is awfully far away. My Uncle Bill told me about it. Tip's Uncle Bill was a wanderer, bitten with mining fever, who had drifted into Sandtown with a broken arm, and when it was well had drifted out again. Where is it? It's down in New Mexico somewheres. There aren't no railroads or anything. You have to go on mules, and you run out of water before you get there and have to drink canned tomatoes. Well, go on, kid. What's it like when you do get there? Tip sat up and excitedly began his story. There's a big red rock there that goes right up out of the sand for about 900 feet. The county's flat all around it, and this here rock goes up all by itself like a monument. They call it the Enchanted Bluff down there, because no white man has ever been on top of it. The sides are smooth rock and straight up like a wall. The Indians say that hundreds of years ago, before the Spaniards came, there was a village way up there in the air. The tribe that lived there had some sort of steps made out of wood and bark, hung down over the face of the bluff, and the braves went down to hunt and carried water up in big jugs swung on their backs. They kept a big supply of water and dried meat up there, and never went down except to hunt. They were a peaceful tribe that made cloth and pottery, and they went up there to get out of the wars. You see, they could pick off any war party that tried to get up their little steps. The Indians say they were a handsome people, and that they had some sort of a queer religion. Uncle Bill thinks they were cliff dwellers who had got into trouble and left home. They weren't fighters, anyhow. One time, the braves were down hunting, and an awful storm came up, a kind of waterspout, and when they got back to their rock, they found their little staircase had been all broken to pieces, and only a few steps were left hanging away up in the air. While they were camped at the foot of the rock, wondering what to do, a war party from the north came along and massacred them to a man, with all the old folks and women looking on from the rock. Then the war party went on south and left the village to get down the best they could. Of course, they never got down. They starved to death up there. And when the war party came back on their way north, they could hear the children crying out from the edge of the bluff where they had crawled out, but they didn't see a sign of a grown Indian. And nobody has ever been up there since." We exclaimed at this dolorous legend and sat up. "There couldn't have been many people up there," Percy demurred. "How big is the top, Tip?" "Oh, pretty big. Big enough so the rock doesn't look nearly as tall as it is. The top's bigger than the base. The bluff is sort of worn away for several 100 feet up. That's one reason it's so hard to climb." I asked how the Indians got up in the first place. "Nobody knows how they got up, or when. A hunting party came along once and saw that there was a town up there, and that was all." Otto rubbed his chin and looked thoughtful. "Of course, there must have been some way to get up there. Couldn't people get a rope over some way and pull a ladder up?" Tip's little eyes were shining with excitement. "I know a way. Me and Uncle Bill talked it all over. There's a kind of rocket that would take a rope over. Lifesavers use 'em. And then you could hoist a rope ladder and peg it down at the bottom and make it tight with guy ropes on the other side. I'm going to climb that there bluff, and I've got it all planned out." Fritz asked what he expected to find when he got up there. "Bones, maybe, or the ruins of their town, or pottery, or some of their idols. There might be most anything up there. Anyway, I want to see." "Sure nobody else has been up there, Tip?" Arthur asked. "Dead sure. Hardly anybody ever goes down there. Some hunters tried to cut steps in the rock once, and they didn't get higher than a man can reach. The bluff's all red granite, and Uncle Bill thinks it's a boulder the glaciers left. It's a queer place anyhow. Nothing but cactus and desert for hundreds of miles, and yet right under the bluff there's good water and plenty of grass. That's why the bison used to go down there." Suddenly we heard a scream above our fire and jumped up to see a dark, slim bird floating southward far above us, a whooping crane we knew by her cry and her long neck. We ran to the edge of the island, hoping we might see her alight, but she wavered southward along the river course until we lost her. The hostler boys declared by the look of the heavens it must be after midnight, so we threw more wood on our fire, put on our jackets, and curled down in the warm sand. Several of us pretended to doze, but I fancy we were really thinking about Tip's Bluff and the extinct people. Over in the wood, the ring-doves were calling mournfully to one another, and once we heard a dog bark far away. "Somebody getting into old Tommy's melon patch," Fritz murmured sleepily, but nobody answered him. By and by, Percy spoke out of the shadow. "Say, Tip, when you go down there, will you take me with you?" "Maybe." "Suppose one of us beats you down there, Tip. Whoever gets to the bluff first has got to promise to tell the rest of us exactly what he finds," remarked one of the hostler boys, and to this we all readily assented. Somewhat reassured, I dropped off to sleep. I must have dreamed about a race for the bluff, for I woke in a kind of fear that other people were getting ahead of me and that I was losing my chance. I sat up in my damp clothes and looked at the other boys, who lay tumbled in uneasy attitudes about the dead fire. It was still dark, but the sky was blue with the last wonderful azure of night. The stars glistened like crystal globes and trembled as if they shone through a depth of clear water. Even as I watched, they began to pale and the sky brightened. Day came suddenly, almost instantaneously. I turned for another look at the blue night, and it was gone. Everywhere the birds began to call, and all manner of little insects began to chirp and hop about in the willows. A breeze sprang up from the west and brought the heavy smell of ripened corn. The boys rolled over and shook themselves. We stripped and plunged into the river just as the sun came up over the windy bluffs. When I came home to Sandtown at Christmas time, we skated out to our island and talked over the whole project of the Enchanted Bluff, renewing our resolution to find it. Although that was 20 years ago, none of us have ever climbed the Enchanted Bluff. Percy Pound is a stockbroker in Kansas City and will go nowhere that his red touring car cannot carry him. Otto Hassler went on the railroad and lost his foot braking, after which he and Fritz succeeded their father as the town tailors. Arthur sat around the sleepy little town all his life. He died before he was 25. The last time I saw him, when I was home on one of my college vacations, he was sitting in a steamer chair under a cottonwood tree in the little yard behind one of the two Sandtown saloons. He was very untidy, and his hand was not steady, but when he rose unabashed to greet me, his eyes were as clear and warm as ever. When I had talked with him for an hour and heard him laugh again, I wondered how it was that when nature had taken such pains with such a man, from his hands to the arch of his long foot, she had ever lost him in Sandtown. He joked about Tip Smith's Bluff, and declared he was going down there as soon as the weather got cooler. He thought the Grand Canyon might be worthwhile, too. I was perfectly sure when I left him that he would never get beyond the high plank fence and the comfortable shade of the cottonwood, and indeed it was under that very tree that he died one summer morning. Tip Smith still talks about going to New Mexico. He married a slatternly, unthrifty country girl, has been much tied to a perambulator, and has grown stooped and gray from irregular meals and broken sleep. But the worst of his difficulties are now over, and he has, as he says, come into easy water. When I was last in Sandtown, I walked home with him late one moonlight night, after he had balanced his cash and shut up his store. We took the long way around, and sat on the schoolhouse steps, and between us we quite revived the romance of the lone red rock and the extinct people. Tip insists that he still means to go down there, but he thinks now that he will wait until his boy Bert is old enough to go with him. Bert has been let into the story and thinks of nothing but the Enchanted Bluff. End of The Enchanted Bluff by Willa Cather. Read by Winston Tharp.